because he had something come up. But inshallah, so today we're covering the Battle of Ahzab, or the Khandaq. And it's kind of one of those things, this was after, who can remind me what, I don't think I was there last week actually, no, so never mind. But last week, just to summarize, we talked about the slander of Aisha radiallahu anha, and basically kind of the events that occurred around that story, right? And so after this point, this was the next major expedition that the Muslims had gone under. And to kind of contextualize what is happening in the Arabian Peninsula at this time, right? The thing is that the Jewish tribes, but before we get that, the Muslims are now like an established power in the Arabian Peninsula, right? So essentially, they actually have real control and political power on the Arabian Peninsula. And because of this political power, every other Arab tribe at the time is beginning to really suffer the consequences of it, right? Especially amongst them are the Quraysh, because obviously Medina is on the way to Syria, right? And the Quraysh's main way of getting economic power and stuff like that is this caravan that they send to and from Syria, right? So they're feeling the effect of the Muslims, right? And we skipped over this, but in between the Battle of Uhud, there was an incident with the Banu Nadir, to which they were basically expelled from Medina, right? Because we skipped over the lesson. But anyway, so they had basically, the Prophet ﷺ told them, take what you can from your camels. You're going to leave your weapons and you're going to leave your property. And just basically they had to emigrate or leave from Medina to Khaybar, right? Khaybar is basically like a little, not a little, it's an establishment close to Medina. And it was basically, it had a lot of date palms and stuff like that, right? If you remember the story of Salman al-Farsi, he predicted that the land to which the Prophet ﷺ was going to come to was Khaybar, because this was the land of date palms, right? So this tribe, the Banu Nadir, left Medina for Khaybar, and they began to establish there, but they left all of their wealth in Medina, right? And because all the Prophet ﷺ said was, you're going to leave your property and you're going to leave your weapons here, right? So, and the Prophet, so because of this now, the Banu Nadir want their power back, right? They want their wealth back, because the value of the land that they had left in Medina was a substantial amount, right? So essentially the Banu Nadir started to hatch a plot to basically launch an offensive against the Muslims, right? And so among these things is that they began to basically gain allies from the other Arabian tribes, right? So among these are like the Quraysh, any of the clan. These are all Arabian tribes. They essentially started to grant alliances to the Banu Nadir, to basically grant an alliance for them, right? And even it got to the point that the Prophet the Quraysh were even surprised that the Jews were actually, because Banu Nadir is a Jewish tribe, by the way. They were amongst the Jewish tribes that was established there. So the Quraysh were surprised that the Banu Nadir was asking the Quraysh for help, because Abu Sufyan, who was the leader of the Quraysh at the time, he was like, you are asking us for help. Is Muhammad ﷺ not closer to your religion than we are, right? So, and also the Quraysh always had this like inferiority complex towards the Jewish tribes, because they saw them as like people who had a book, people who had established powers, And even in Medina, the Jews lived in like fortresses and stuff like that. This is a trend that you even see nowadays, right? That even in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said about basically the Jewish people, right? Or not the Jewish people, but the Jews and the Jewish tribes, that they will be stricken with disgrace wherever they go, unless they are protected by a covenant with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or a treaty with the people, right? So even in this case, in the Battle of Ahzab, the Banu Nadir don't have any political strength of their own, right? Even their power came from their fortresses and stuff like that. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala even says that essentially they thought that their fortresses were going to withstand the plan of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but nothing can withstand that plan, right? So So essentially, the Banu Nadir is now gathering allies, and Allah Subhanahu wa Taala even predicts this, right? And in light of Israel and stuff like that, even this is true to this day, right? Either the Jews, or not the Jews. Almost maybe that sounds kind of too bad, but like Israel, for example, right? The only power they have is by people giving them power, right? And it says this in this verse right here, right? They are only given power unless they are protected by a covenant with Allah or with a treaty from the people, right? And who's pumping all the money into Israel? It's even true to this day, right? And this shows that this is a true sign of like this Quran is actually, right? It's predicting things to this day. So this is what the plan of the Banu Nadir is. And so basically they were able to gather a force of around 10,000 people, right? So the other trend that we see that we notice is that the amount of the size of the armies are increasing and increasing, right? The Battle of Uhud or Battle of Badr, for the first time the Quraysh came together, and the Quraysh is a coalition of sub-tribes, right? This was the first time they came together. It was a force of 1,000, right? Uhud was more than that. And then this is the most amount. And what's setting a precedent is that it is basically becoming a battle between Islam and disbelief, basically, right? Because everyone, it's the Jewish people, it's the mushrikun, the people of Mecca. It's basically, and there's some Bedouin tribes thrown in there as well. It's basically everyone that doesn't want Islam to spread. This is what kind of is it being established, right? And as we'll get to in the conquest of Mecca, right? That's when like it really becomes a trend of just fully the Muslims against everybody who doesn't want the Muslims, right? I'll ask this question. Does anybody know who first suggested the idea of building the trench, right? Who was the Sahaba or the companion? Salman al-Farsi, yeah. And why did he? Where did he get the idea from? Exactly. So because Salman al-Farsi was from Persia, right? He was from Iran, and these are people who kind of are this Persian Empire, right? So they're used to war. They have these like strategies and stuff like that, right? So he's like, okay, and the Muslims are not, they don't have an army size of 10,000 yet, so they are outnumbered, but they said, okay, he suggested to build this trench to basically inhibit the army from advancing, essentially, right? Because if you can stop this army from coming, then you have a significant advantage, right? And also it's simply because the Muslims weren't prepared for like a siege of this level either, right? They weren't expecting that the entire Arabian Peninsula was going to unite together in a band of 10,000 people to launch an offensive against the Muslims, right? And then he sallallahu alaihi wasallam also then suggested basically hiding the women and children in the fortress of Banu Haritha, right? So Banu Haritha was a tribe within within Medina, and these people kind of built a fortress similar to what the Jewish tribes were doing, right? So that in Medina, you can kind of think of the Jewish tribes would have their like fortresses and cities separate from the rest of the city, right? So in light of this, because of, like I said, the Arabs kind of always had an inferiority complex against them because they saw this as like an establishment of like power of civilization, right? So basically what they did was they had their own fortress, right? So then because the Prophet ﷺ said, if we are going to go out and defend the trench and stuff like that, Medina is essentially defenseless, right? And it's because of the Banu Qurayza, who was the last Jewish tribe inside of Medina, and we'll get to the treachery, but they were planning to basically, they ended up breaking the treaty and there's going to be some peace and stuff like that. They essentially planned to literally execute the women and children that were inside of the fortress, right? But the Prophet ﷺ anticipated this because he didn't know where the loyalties of the Banu Qurayza was going to lie, right? So that's basically like kind of the establishment of the Battle of Khandaq, right? So the Banu Nadir is gaining power, launching an offensive, and now it's almost like an act of desperation. They can't really do much, but they're going to build this trench that essentially inhibits the armies from advancing, right? So the Prophet ﷺ in order to build this trench, this trench is not an easy thing to build because it's around 2 kilometers long. So he appointed us around 10 people for every single portion of the trench. And the reason why is, if you have natural protection, Medina was surrounded by, who can tell me what was Medina surrounded by? Anybody, sisters, brothers? Volcanic rock was one. And the trees, yes. So essentially Medina was covered by all sides, besides this little section in the front, right? So this was the only concern that they have, because you can't bring an army. It's almost just, it's described as like, a volcanic plain, right? It's like very sharp rocks. I don't even know how to describe it. But, if you anticipate there being like volcanic activity, it's going to be like obsidian. I don't know, I'm not a geologist, but you can anticipate it's going to be very difficult to bring a large army. And on the backside of Medina, there is a very dense orchard, right? Because Medina is known as a land, as a land of date palms as well, right? So you can't just march an army of 10,000 strong through this thing. It's almost impossible, right? So the only stretch of land that was potentially dangerous for which an army can go through is this 2-kilometer section, right? So the companions had to build this 2-kilometer long trench within 10 days, right? And in these days it might be a little easier, but there's no excavators, there's no bulldozers, nothing like that back in those days, right? So they had to work essentially non-stop, night and day. The companions and even the Prophet ﷺ, they were just digging and digging and digging, right? And actually, because the Prophet ﷺ was also digging as well, when they saw him working as hard, they would actually work even harder, right? Because this is your Prophet, this is your leader that's going to be digging the trench, right? Working harder than you, you're going to say, who am I? I'm going to work even harder, right? And the Prophet ﷺ, and this was a very, very fatiguing process, right? So the Battle of Khandaq, it genuinely was a very almost torturous experience for the Muslims, right? Because it lasted around a month, and around a month it was just non-stop labor, and as we'll get to, even fear. Like they were fearful for because of the treachery of the Banu Qurayza, and also the fact that there's like an army of 10,000 people on the other side, right? So essentially, the Prophet ﷺ would see the Ansar and the Muhajirun, and he made dua for them, right? He's saying, Allah, oh Allah, there's no good but in the Akhirah, so have mercy on the Ansar and the Muhajirun, right? And then they would reply to him with, we are the ones who have given you our oath on jihad, so as long as we will do this, as long as we live, we will do this, right? So they were basically saying, this was part of their jihad, this was part of the oath that they had given the Prophet ﷺ, that whatever you command, we are going to do, right? And so in Al-Bara ibn Azab, he says, he's seeing the Prophet ﷺ working extra hard, right? He's saying, on the day of Khandaq, I saw the Prophet ﷺ carrying the dust for so long, so the dirt and whatever, right? Whatever pales, it's a very dirty process, right? So he's saying that his chest hair was covered with dust, right? So the Prophet ﷺ was labor, he was going through the labor. He grabbed the shovel, he grabbed the pickaxe, whatever it was, and he himself was working so hard. He was shirtless and he was moving dust and moving in there, right there with the companions, right? So and you kind of think about it. This is one of the proofs of the Prophet, of the truth of the Prophet ﷺ, right? That most leaders, that whenever you never see the leader, the head honcho, in there with your workers and stuff like that, working. But he ﷺ, out of his sincerity, right, out of the truth of him, would do this, right? So, and also you can kind of think about it as you're doing manual labor, the companions and everybody like that. If you've seen sailors, pirates, they're singing their ocean songs or whatever, right? So even the companions, they would recite aloud poetry as well. So you can kind of think of just that whole scene, all the companions, it was in the winter, so it wasn't scorching heat or anything like that, but it was still manual labor, right? So they're trying to break the monotony of just digging and digging and digging with poetry and stuff like that. Right. So, and among one of the things that happened, and that among one of the added difficulties to the Battle of Khandaq, was that there was a food shortage as well, right? Because it was winter, so the harvest season is not at that time typically. And this added to the difficulty of the Sahaba, because they literally had no food. They were doing manual labor, and they just didn't have anything to eat. And the Sahaba described what they used to eat. So some of them, they said they would have dried barley, which is like, you can kind of think of basically like maybe like roasted barley, something like that, right? They would literally mix it with oil so it becomes somewhat of a paste. They would just eat that, right? And they would even they described it as foul smell. Like literally it smelled bad, but because of their desperation and their need of food, they would be forced to eat it, right? And subhanAllah, this one was like crazy to me. But even some of them would just simply eat the pits of dates, right? Like they not even the dates, but they would like maybe grind them up. I don't even know if they grind it up, but they would just literally eat the date seeds themselves to stop themselves from being hungry. And subhanAllah, and even then, they're still digging, they're still in this labor, right? And the Prophet ﷺ, it was custom at the time, like, because all the companions, they live very simple lives, they're always hungry. He ﷺ, there's narrations of, the Prophet ﷺ having no food at home. He goes out, he finds Abu Bakr and Umar, and they also have no food, and then they go out to just the market or whatever, and they hope that Allah provides them literally with food, and these are the three best people like that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has sent down, right? Or Abu Bakr, like the giants, so even he in this time, what they would do is they would tie rocks to their stomachs to basically make them not feel the pangs of hunger, right? Because when you have like something on your stomach, you'll trick your mind into basically thinking I'm not actually hungry. So as the Prophet ﷺ was like working, I think it was Jabir. It was Jabir. So he says that he saw this rock tied to the Prophet ﷺ, and when he saw this is the Prophet of Allah, right? So your heart breaks for him, and you say, I have to do something, basically, right? So he goes home to his wife, and he says to her, I have seen something that I cannot bear. And he basically asks us, what do you have to offer, basically? Like do we have anything at all? And even Jabir and Sahaba, they didn't have anything much at all, right? And so his wife replied with, we only have a little bit of bread and a baby goat as well. And this goat is it's very small. It's not even a year old. So typically you wouldn't slaughter a goat of that size because you're just not going to get a lot of meat from it, right? So he basically brought this to the Prophet ﷺ. Whatever this meal they had, they prepared the bread, he slaughtered the goat, they cooked something. And it's actually almost funny, but he goes to the Prophet ﷺ and he says, in secret, kind of like, you and maybe you bring two other people, we're going to eat this meal together, right? And the Prophet ﷺ instead stands up to the congregation, stands up to everybody, and he says, Ya Ahl al-Khandaq. So the people of Khandaq, Jabir and his wife have prepared a meal for all of us, right? So he's essentially inviting the whole army, the entire army, and the army was about 1,000 people strong. He's essentially inviting, Jabir and his wife have cooked a meal for us, so come and eat to your fill, right? SubhanAllah. And Jabir is now he's like, what are we going to do? He goes back to his wife and he tells her what happened. And his wife kind of says, did you say this? Or did the Prophet ﷺ say it? And he says, he did. And then his wife then said, in her faith and tawakkul in Allah, she didn't worry. She said, okay, if the Prophet ﷺ said it, there's going to be some barakah that comes from it, right? And this is what the concept of barakah is. It's when you have more from little, right? Like a single dollar, like for example, a single dollar goes a long way. That's why we ask Allah for barakah in everything, because a single dollar that we have, you're gonna get more from it, right? The idea is more from less. So the Prophet ﷺ, after they cook the meal basically, and it's literally one pot. Like the quantity of the meal is not like all of a sudden it expanded out into a whole feast or anything like that. They cooked it into a one pot, and maybe I don't know what they did with the bread, But so the Prophet ﷺ basically told Jabir, essentially, don't open this pot until I am there, right? And as soon as he came to the food, he made dua and actually spit in it, right? So he made dua asking Allah to bless it and stuff like that, and he actually spit in it because even the spit of the Prophet ﷺ has barakah in it, right? And then once he did this, he invited 10 people to come in. They ate to their fill, 10 people left, right? Another 10 people came in, and because their house only fits 10 people, right? 10 people came in, ate to their fill, and then they left, right? And then it was up until like the entire all 1,000 people, they ate to their fill, subhanAllah. So from this is one of the miracles of the Battle of Khandaq, that from the little food that they had, subhanAllah, the whole army had basically eaten to their fill, right? And this is like, as I said, the concept of barakah, right? Like, you're getting more from less, right? Like, whatever money that you have, it goes a lot longer. And that's why they say, like, haram money, there's no barakah in it. So even if you have like $1 million, the money you're like, where's my money going, basically, so that's one story. And there was another incident that had happened where basically it's a story of the stone, right? So as the companions are digging this trench, obviously when you're unearthing things, you're going to run into things in the earth that you can't break, right? So there was a large stone in the path of the trench, and many Sahaba tried to like break it, right? One person tried, went down, they couldn't like even break it, right? And another person, they couldn't break it, and another person was still on safe, right? So and some of the components suggested they just go around this stone, right? Like, because if it's in the path, just go around it, and it will still serve its purpose, right? But in their adherence to what the Prophet ﷺ had commanded them, they said, no, we're going to continue straight. Like, basically, they didn't even act without checking with the Prophet ﷺ whether they are even allowed to go around it, right? That's how, like, time and time again, there's so many examples of the companions sticking to what they would follow his command so literally because of their adherence to the Quran and the Sunnah. They would not even think of moving around the stone without actually checking with the Quran. So I'll kind of skip over the story very quickly. But essentially, the Prophet ﷺ came and he said, "Hand me the pickaxe, hand me the axe." He descends into the trench and he says 3 times, or 3 separate times, right? So he says one time, Bismillah, Allahu Akbar. A third of the stone crumbled, right? Then he says Bismillah, Allahu Akbar. Then another third of the stone crumbled, and then Bismillah, Allahu Akbar. And then that's when the whole stone had crumbled. And you can kind of think of it, this is a deep trench, right? This is a trench that's designed to stop an entire army. So the stone's not going to be tiny. But, and on each time, the Prophet ﷺ has said, he has given me the keys to Sham first. That's on the first one. It's basically saying, I have been promised Syria. Then the second one, he says, I have been promised Persia. I see the palaces and the white pillars of Persia. And then he says on the third one, I have been promised Yemen. And towards the end of as the companions began to conquer, the first area outside of the Arabian Peninsula was conquered was Sham. Then it was Persia, and then it was Yemen, as exactly the Prophet ﷺ had prophesied here, right? So basically, that's the building of the trench. That's basically before the army, the army of 10,000 on the other side had actually arrived, right? So now that the trench is essentially dug, and they have like a little encampment on the other side, right? And you can kind of think of it as like it's 2 kilometers long, right? So it's designed to stop an army, but there's going to be like people coming in and out, right? It's not designed to stop like an individual that's coming from the enemy or something like that, right? So that's one of the fears that they always had, There could be spies and stuff like that, literally. So the Prophet ﷺ, you have to patrol this 2 kilometer long trench. I don't know how many that is in miles, so like it's hard to kind of picture. But so he basically had patrol squads constantly 24/7 patrolling the trench, right? And he actually commanded them to literally shout Allahu Akbar, to basically let people know that, hey, there's people on the other side, right? Like this is like in that the area was actually populated and stuff like that, right? And even the Prophet ﷺ himself would also go on these patrols. Again, it goes to show, like, even he was a leader of everything, right? Like most leaders, they would send their men and stuff like that, right? But he ﷺ went out himself and actually did this patrolling as well, right? And then it was Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas who got up in the middle of the night. He saw the Prophet ﷺ patrolling, and he didn't allow this. He basically said, allow me to take over your shift, and he allowed the Prophet ﷺ to rest as well, right? So Again, the added there's another trial that's coming to the Muslims, and that is the treachery that the Banu Qurayza were basically planning, right? Because at this point, all your men, everybody is out there in this area outside of Medina. So your city's defenseless, basically, right? And even though you hid like your families and stuff like that in that fortress, as I mentioned earlier, the Banu Qurayza were planning an assault basically on this fortress, and the fortress is defenseless people, right? There's nobody there. That shows them how like evil, like the evil that they were planning as well, right? So rumors began to spread that the Banu Qurayza were planning this treachery, and because of that, the Sahaba began to like basically feel fear, right? And as I'll get to later in Surah Ahzab, Allah Subhanahu wa Taala describes that this was a shaking, like literally a shaking to the core of the believers, right? What are you going to do in situations where you're genuinely fearful? Are you going to hold on to tawakkul? Are you going to hold on to the faith in Allah? And the thing is, like, even if you become like a little shaky, like you're like, oh, you're in a really, really bad situation, right? And that's what the companions were at this point in time, right? Even if you have this really bad feeling, like you're saying, like, even Allah Subhanahu wa Taala can't help my situation, or the help of Allah is not coming. They began to think things like this, right? But that's not a sign of like hypocrisy. That's not a sign of weak men or anything like that. It's at the end of the day, it shows the humanity of the companions as well, right? So basically, they described it as one of the worst nights for them, right? And you can also just imagine the situation. 10,000 people are on the other side, and you have to defend. Otherwise, this wave of 10,000 people are going to just destroy your city, But at home, you're worried about your families because of the treachery of the Banu Qurayza, right? They're literally planning an assault on the fortress as well, right? So they began to really feel fear, and the Prophet ﷺ, before he kind of spread, like it was announced. It was never really announced, but he kind of did this very meticulously and with wisdom, right? He sent delegates to the Banu Qurayza asking, is this truly what's going to happen? And it became clear in their response, right? Immediately in their response, they were it's described as really the most vulgar that they were to the Muslims. And they blatantly said, who is this Muhammad that you're talking to, right? Or who is this Muhammad you're talking about? We have no treaty. They literally ripped up the treaty. So then they returned back, and then it was a clear indication that there was treachery being planned, like pure treachery. So the Prophet ﷺ now had to basically worry about this, right? And in Surah Ahzab, this is as I was talking about. This was one of the trials of the Battle of Khandaq, and to have that tawakkul and be patient in what's coming, right? In verse 12 or 112, he says, Allah Subhanahu wa Taala says, remember when they came at you from east and west? You can kind of think of it as the entire horizon, 10,000 people. All you see is this giant army, right? When your eyes grew wild in horror and your hearts jumped to your throats, right? So they're feeling the true fear that may Allah protect us from ever having to feel and stuff like that, right? So they fear like they have never feared before, and you entertain conflicting thoughts about Allah Subhanahu wa Taala, right? So he's saying that you begin to have good thoughts, but you also begin to have bad thoughts as well. Basically, like saying, where is the help of Allah Subhanahu wa Taala coming from? I guess you can kind of say like the situation is so cooked. You're like, even Allah Subhanahu wa Taala can't help this situation, right? And in the next verse, he says, then and there the believers were put to the test and were violently shaken, literally violently shaken to their core, because that's what they were feeling, right? And SubhanAllah, like, remember that this is after many people have converted already, right? The early Muslims, they were the strongest of the strong, right? Like the people who endured the persecution of Mecca and stuff like that. That was they were the cream of the crop. I think it's the same, cream of the crop, right? But there's people who converted later, just normal Sahaba. The Sahaba were humans at the end of the day, right? So they also felt this fear of, what's going to happen, where is the help from Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala coming from? They began, this was a test for them as well, right? They were like, the Sahaba were the best generation, but at the end of the day, they were still humans at the end of the day, right? And in their basically not in their fear and stuff like that, we see like if they were shaken to the core, if they had like these kind of feelings, we're gonna feel these things too, and it's totally okay that we feel these things, right? It's not a sign of like hypocrisy, or it's not a sign of like, you know, weak iman that you feel fear and stuff like that. Even the Sahaba had done this. It's just human nature, right? And but anyways, and continuing from this, the hypocrites also became a problem, right? Because now the hypocrites took the excuse of Banu Qurayza to want to basically return back to their the city, right? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says about them, and remember when the hypocrites and those with sickness in their hearts said, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and his messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam have promised us nothing but delusion, right? So he's basically like in adding to like the stress of the situation, they're basically saying this prophet is promising you false things, like it's never going to work out. You know, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they quoted things like, you know, we were promised the things of Kisra, we were promised the lands of Sham, of Persia, of Yemen, and we're in this terrible situation, right? Like we can't even go and there's a narration that one of the hypocrites shouted out loud, basically, or you know, said to the congregation, we're not even able to go to the bathroom, basically, without like in fear, right, or without discomfort and stuff like that, right? So how are these promises going to come, right? And you know, in their impatience, the hypocrites were literally being impatient. It wasn't even like 3 or 4 years until they had began to conquer the entire Arabian Peninsula, and then, you know, as we know, Abu Bakr and everybody began to spread Islam as well, right? So let's see. I'll skip over some details as well. Okay, so I guess I'll talk about kind of the actual fighting that had happened. There was very minimal. Like even the number of casualties that had happened in the Battle of Khandaq were very few, right? Who can name one of the casualties of the? This is a question. Who was one of the companions that had died martyred in the Battle of Khandaq? You know, good. And what happened when Sa'd ibn Mu'adh was martyred? What was the significance? There's a famous narration. Leader of the Ansar, but there was a famous narration. Like what happened when when Sa'd ibn Mu'adh? Throne of Allah shook, right? Literally, the throne of Allah shook with either anger or excitement that the prophet, he will see Sa'd ibn Mu'adh. Sa'd ibn Mu'adh was like the one who during the Battle of Badr, you know, the Prophet ﷺ asked, "What should we do?" That was another cooked situation, quote unquote, you know. And the Prophet ﷺ is asking the congregation. There's an army of 1,000 people coming, and he's really targeting the Ansar. He's saying, "You guys don't have any political alliance. You just have to defend me, right? But we're launching an offensive. What are you going to do?" Right? He's a very competitive. Wherever you go, we will charge forward with you, even if it's in basically like, we will follow you over the he is one who ended up being martyred in this battle. And amongst one of the small skirmishes I'll just quickly go over is the one of a small contingency. Like it's a group of 5, right? They literally took their horses and they were able to cross over the trench into the territory of the Muslims, right? And this was led by Amr ibn Abdul Wud, who was one of the Quraysh, and he was known as the most ferocious warrior, very, very ferocious warrior, even during the Battle of Badr. He had this red turban that was literally going on the front of his chest, right? The red turban was instead of hide, kind of camouflage yourself or anything like that, the red turban would stick out in the desert. It was basically just telling them, come fight me, I will basically kill you, right? So I'm going to then go, once this contingency goes over, the way the Arabs basically held their battles was they would start any war with like what's called a mubaraza, which is like a one-on-one, and through this one-on-one, Amr is basically saying, who will fight me? And in his bravery, and this is honestly like kind of one of the coldest scenes in the Seerah, Ali ibn Abi Talib, we really see his bravery. Right? So he, at this time, is only around 20 years old. He's like a young man, and Amr is a seasoned warrior, like the cream of the crop. Everybody knows that this is someone that you don't like want to fight, right? So when Amr it says who is going to fight me, Ali ibn Abi Talib says I will fight you, and the Prophet ﷺ even told him, why are you saying this? I'm going to fight you, right? He's Amr, and you know you should send someone who's more seasoned, someone who's older to basically go and fight him, right? And this. So and then Ali didn't say anything because the Prophet ﷺ is telling him no. He's waiting for his permission essentially, right? So then this happens 2 more times, right? Amr is basically saying, who's going to fight me in the Mubaraza? Nobody dares stand up. And then Ali says, send me, I will do it. And the Prophet ﷺ again tells him, don't do it. And the 3rd time, the Prophet ﷺ allows him to basically go and to this Mubaraza, right? And even Amr, he's seen Ali raised up as a kid, right? Because during the times of Jahiliyyah, you know, he sees him as like a young person, right? He's saying, why are you like you are a kid? I don't want to kill a young child, basically, right? And he's saying, go and find somebody who's more senior, basically who's an actual man, so I can fight him, right? And Ali ibn Abi Talib then says to him, but I have the desire to kill you, right? And really like contextualize this, right? This is like I don't know, maybe like the most ferocious warrior at the time, and this kid comes and says, I'm gonna kill you, basically, right? And it's at this point they were on 2 horses. They charged towards each other, right? So basically when the horses are charging towards each other, the Sahaba and everybody else, they can't see what's going on because all the dust is getting kicked up. It's literally a cloud of dust that's happened that gets kicked up. So now they don't know what's going on the inside, right? And the only indication, and if you didn't know, Ali won, obviously, you know, but you know, the only indication that he even won was there was a loud Allahu Akbar that had come from the center of this dust, right? And in other narrations, it's kind of described like in the midst of that that interaction, of that battle, as the 2 horses are coming towards each other, Amr jumps off of his horse to fight on foot, right? Ali does the same thing, and you know, essentially this is again the most ferocious warrior. Amr tries to land a blow onto Ali, right? But then what Ali does is, in a split second, he defends. He raises his shield. The shield cuts like shatters in half, basically, right? Because this is a big dude. This is a guy. He hit the shield, and it was a shield made of metal as well, right? It wasn't a weak thing. So that broke, and then in a split second, Ali took his sword, and it got stabbed into the neck of Amr, right? So in a split second, he beat one of the most feared warriors, essentially, right? And this goes to show again, Ali was considered a warrior. He was very strong, and you know, a very brave from his very youth, right? Obviously, he was the first child that had essentially accepted Islam, right? So that goes to show the bravery of Ali radiallahu anhu. But anyways, I'll kind of skip some things. So essentially, as we know, probably the Battle of Khandaq, besides these small skirmishes and stuff like that, you know, the Mubaraza of Ali, and then also the Sa'd ibn Mu'adh was martyred. There was really no other battles that had happened. There was small skirmishes, but what basically ended the Battle of Khandaq was the wind that had come and essentially destroyed the entire enemy encampment, right? So it's Surah Ahzab verse 9. After the Muslims had suffered for basically a whole month, right? A whole month had gone by. There's no food. It's freezing outside too because it's in the winter time, and they are fatigued from building the wall, or not building the wall, building the digging the trench, and patrolling the trench day in and day out, right? So they are just absolutely tired, but because they were patient, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends the wind to the storm basically that essentially cleared out the entire enemy encampment. And it's described that even there wasn't a single tent of the Quran, which is one of the tribes on there. There wasn't a single tent that had remained after the storm. Right? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because the Muslims were being patient, because the Muslims had endured for so long, he gave them the victory essentially, right? He, like you know, even the angels had come down and basically eradicated the forces, right? And then this is revealed in Surah Ahzab verse 9. O believers, remember Allah's favor upon you when the enemy forces came to besiege you in Medina. And so we sent them against them a bitter wind and forces you cannot see. And Allah is seeing, all-seeing of what you do, right? And again, I got about the point of the wind. You know, it's one thing to just say, like a little breeze eliminated them, right? But the Sahaba would like describe the wind as being as loud as thunder, literally. Or like when the wind is really loud, you kind of hear the howling of it. They described it as thunder, which just goes to show how extreme the wind was, right? And the Prophet ﷺ said, Allah has granted us victory through the wind of Saba. You know, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes how like his armies are also the wind and stuff like that, right? So there's the wind of Saba was sent to help the Muslims in this, and that's essentially all I had. If you guys have any questions or anything like that. Barakallah feekum. Inshallah, we'll be back next week. I don't know what the topic is, but either maybe we can do more Battle of Ahzab, or you know, because there was some things that we had actually skipped over, like some details and stuff like that. But inshallah, and then the next thing we'll probably talk about is the what happens to the Banu Qurayza, right? Because we kind of went over the treachery, but we didn't really go into detail onto what exactly happened. So jazakumullah khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.